If there's a comparison that we're quite flattered when people use about us is, some people call us the consumer reports of the content technology space. So we produce research on technologies. We evaluate them on what they're good at, and maybe more importantly, what they're not so good at. Okay? So that's what we have a bunch of subscribers who subscribe to our research on an ongoing basis. We have tools that help you make decisions as to what vendors should be on your short list, tools that help you compare vendors side by side, again, with highlighting what they're good at and what they're not so good at. We do some consulting as well, and a big part of our consulting is helping people pick the right technology for what they're trying to do. And that's really where a lot of the content for this presentation today comes from. Our real world experiences helping organizations who come to us and say, help us pick the right technology. So this is the world that we live in. I mentioned we cover content-based technologies. We help people select technologies of all shapes and sizes, but from a research perspective, we cover digital marketing technologies and digital workplace technologies. We've been around for a little over 16 years now and have had the pleasure of working with over 4,000 customers in more than 60 countries around the world. I use that consumer reports analogy at the outset, and it's really not by accident that we get compared to consumer reports. When our founder of our company, my business partner Tony, used the actual consumer reports business model as the model for a real story group. So when you hear us talking about vendors, we do not work for software vendors in any way. We do not speak at software vendor events. We don't write white papers for vendors. We don't take meals from vendors. It's fundamentally ingrained in everything we do because our whole mission is to sit on your side of the table as technology buyers and help you make the right decision. And as you might imagine, that allows us to be a little bit more free in the way we talk about technology. So we don't pull any punches. I encourage you, if any of our research appeals to you, download a copy, a free chapter of our research. You'll see we write a little bit different than most analyst firms. We don't sugarcoat it. We'll tell it like it is because, quite frankly, we don't care what the vendors think about us. We care about doing what is best for you as potential buyers. My colleague Tony and I also just last month, we had a book published called The Right Way to Select Technology. And if any of you are interested in getting a copy, I have a few to give away today. The publisher told me I could give away 2 hard copies and two digital copies. So I gave you all an index card when you came in. If you write your name and email on there and give it to me after, I'll pull a couple names and a couple of you can go home with a book if you want. I'm also the lead analyst at Real Story Group on digital asset and asset management research that we cover. And if anyone wants a copy of a chapter of that, please feel free to go to the website and download that. So today, we live in interesting times. It's a very confusing world out there. There's a lot of vendors trying to get your attention. Anyone ever seen this graphic? It's a great one from someone called Chief Martech. He's been doing it over the years to try to map out the marketing technologies that are out there. And he called this year's the Martech 5000 because he literally had to hire extra people to his firm to put this graphic together. And so not surprisingly, people are getting flooded with information, flooded with sales information, flooded with marketing information from all sorts of different vendors. And then, quite frankly, as analysts, it's hard for us to make any sense of this. As buyers of technology, it's really hard to try to say, I know I have a problem, but what do I even need? And where should I even start looking? This is the world as we see it. We tried to make some sense out of it. We have this thing called the vendor subway map, and if anyone wants a copy of this, see me afterwards. I brought a few copies, but we try to bubble up what we consider are the most significant vendors in the marketplace, and show their role in this space. Happy to talk more about that at another time. But we're here today to talk about the right way to select technology. But before I can do that, I got to talk about the wrong way to select technology, because as someone who's been doing this for close to 20 years now, I can say I've seen a lot of projects go wrong. Any of you been a part of a failed technology implementation? Come on, don't be shy. It's a safe place. Any of you thinking about embarking in a technology implementation, selection and implementation? I figured, otherwise you wouldn't have come to this session. But the number that's thrown out there all the time is that half of technology projects fail. Sometimes you hear more like 3/4 of these things fail. Now, technology implementations can fail for a whole slew of different reasons. But nothing is more depressing than seeing a technology project go off the rails at the very start when you choose the wrong technology to begin with. So why does that happen? Well, let's look at the wrong way. So the traditional method, this is the first example I'm going to give you, is something we call blind love. This happens when people like you come to a conference like this, you go into that room over there with all the booths, and guess what? They all have these really slick demos, and they all look good. And then you go back to your office and say, wow, I found the solution for us. They always look good when they come to these conferences, I promise you. They always look good, but in the real world, that's not always the case. The next kind of wrong way to select technology is something that we call happiness is a warm set of binders. Now, this might be the most prevalent of these ways that these projects go off the rails. And oftentimes when you get assigned to a new technology project, the first thing that you do is go around to your colleagues and try to document every single requirement that you're going to need. Anyone ever done that? I have. And what do? You get this laundry list of requirements in an Excel spreadsheet. You put this into an RFP, you throw it over the wall to a bunch of vendors, and what do you get back? Something that looks like that. At the end of the day, all you have is a big laundry list of requirements and nothing else. I'm going to tell you a better way than that. The next way is the My Cousin Vinny approach. And this is the approach where you might be talking to a friend at home or someone you meet at a conference like this, and tell them about the problem you're having back in your business, and they say, oh, well, we had that same problem. Let me introduce you to my vendor. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Almost always, there's a different solution that's going to meet your needs. The next one is the family car approach. I don't know about any of you, but when I first got my driver's license, I was really hoping for my first car was going to be some nice red something. Well, I ended up with something like this because my family had a car, had a minivan, and that's the car I drove. I didn't just get handed a new car. It's a little bit like some of you on the business side who go to your IT departments and say, hey, we need new technology. Well, we already have this. Can't you just use this? It happens all the time. You try to force fit something that wasn't built for your needs into something that is totally the wrong use case. Anyone ever been to a horse race? Come on, we have some degenerate gamblers. Again, safe space. You go into a horse race, the first thing they do, they give you this little sheet, this racing form, right? And it tells you like this much information about each horse. And you're supposed to put your hard-earned money on a horse based on that much information. I say it's a little bit like looking at some of those other industry analysts' graphics. We'll call them quadrants or waves or whatnot. But they're single snapshot views of a marketplace. You have very little information. You just say, well, I'm just going to pick the ones in the upper right and make that my short list. Good luck. Sometimes the very best solution we've seen is in the lower left of that quadrant because it was a solution that was best for what you were trying to do. The next one is finding an implementer, a consultant first, and who's going to do some technology implementation for you and saying, will you tell us what technology we should use? Sounds good, but it's a little bit like going to find the right car for you and going to the Jeep guys and asking them to, hey, suggest for me what car I should get. I'm pretty well certain they're going to recommend a Jeep, right? It's just like I come from an implementation background working for an agency myself, and even though all these agencies call themselves independent and neutral, you can only, as an implementer, you can only know a handful of technologies. So when your clients come to you asking for recommendations, you're only going to recommend one of those handful of technologies. That's what happens over and over again. And finally, the Google approach. I see it time and time again. People go right to Google. I need streaming technology. Let's Google it. The only time you should really start and end there is if you're looking for SEO technology. That's the only time you should go to Google to search. But ultimately, we don't want to let it come down to guessing. So let's talk about a different way. We've come up with this methodology that we call RSVP. It's kind of a silly little name, but Real Story Vendor Procurement. There's 20 different steps across 6 different phases, and I'm not going to go through all of these today, certainly. But if I kind of bubble this down to what is most important, we tried to flip the traditional way of looking at software technology selection on its head a bit, and we actually looked to this really massive trend that's happening across multiple worlds, and all worlds, if you will, and that is something that was called design thinking. Everyone ever heard of design thinking? It's been around for quite some time, but it's really in vogue right now. And Stanford has done a ton of work on this. And this is their graphic, Stanford's design school graphic, where they talk about the 5 steps of design thinking. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So what we tried to do is take these design thinking principles and apply this to technology selection. So we broke it down to 5 steps of our own. So when we empathize, we want to create stories. When we define, we're going to look at the right RFP and shortlist. We're going to ideate. We're going to prototype and test. And I'm going to get into all these in a few seconds. But ultimately, what you're doing here is creating a process that's testable every step of the way, so that you can winnow down your choices to an ultimate partner of yours that you're fully confident in moving forward with. So let's go through it a different way in a bit of detail. So the first thing that I encourage everyone to do is you got to have the right shortlist. Okay? It's critical to have the right shortlist. So when thinking about streaming media or video in general, there's some big bucket categories that I'm sure you're all aware of. You know, there's the enterprise video platforms, there's unified communications vendors who say they play in this space, there's online video platforms, there's media asset management platforms. But I don't want you to just look at Uber categories and start there. Don't just go get the magic quadrant or whatnot for these categories and have that be your only research in coming up with a short list. I want you to really dig into what am I actually trying to do? What are my use cases? So dig into what are you actually going to be using this software for? Are you going to be using it for e-learning or training? Are you going to be using this for e-commerce scenarios? Are you going to be using it for content marketing scenarios? Are you going to be using it for advertising scenarios? Are you going to be using this for live events, web conferencing, you name it. Really dig into the details there, and then go scour the marketplace and find the vendors that were fundamentally built for those use cases. Because what we found was vendors in these marketplaces were built with some very specific use cases in mind initially, and then they bolted on a bunch of other stuff. So their salespeople all say, oh yeah, we do all these things. But when we put these things through the test, and we've seen it happen time and time again, the use cases they were fundamentally built for are the ones that they're still best at. And so again, I beat up on my analyst brethren, but don't just go to that marketplace and look to the upper right. You're going to be doing yourself a major disservice there. So rather, the approach that we like to recommend to our clients is use something that we call a real quadrant. So we built this tool that actually has you self-identify what scenarios are most important to you in your organization, give them some weightings, and ultimately come up with a real quadrant or a quadrant that gives you an upper right that is fundamentally targeted to your needs. So you're really honing in on use case suitability and fit, as opposed to just what some analysts said is the best in the marketplace. So I mentioned, I'm going to go back to that happiness is a warm set of binders. There's plenty of time to gather requirements and do detailed requirement gathering for the sake of building out your solution. But don't use that as the starting point to go finding what vendors are best for you. Rather, what I want you to do is really focus on writing some testable narrative scenarios. Here's an example of some, this is actually a real use case scenario that we helped build out for one client who was looking for an online video tool. And what I want you to do is make these narrative scenarios as real as possible. So identify real users within your organization, You can change their name, but really describe your real environments, describe your real challenges, in this case, this organization had 50,000 employees around the world, and they were doing this live feed from the CEO to California, Florida, Paris, and New Zealand, and they needed to make sure that everyone was getting the information at the right time and the right way. And finally, really hone in on the processes that make your situation the most unique as possible. So the key here, I always say there's a bit of art and science in creating these scenarios, because you want to be descriptive of your situation, but you don't want to be overly prescriptive of a solution. Because you want to describe your people, your processes, your content, but you want to give the vendors a little bit of leeway to say, here's how my solution best meets your needs. Make sense? These scenarios are fundamental to flipping this process on its head, because when you use these scenarios at various stages. So once you have your shortlist defined, it's time to invite vendors to demo their solution. Anyone ever sat in vendor demos, like a vendor demo week? I have. It's what I do for a living. That's usually me, right there. They can be painful. But the way that you prevent them from being painful is you make them as real as possible, as applicable to your needs as you possibly can. And so how do you do that? Well, you actually have the vendors come in and actually demo the scenarios that you've written out. Don't let them come in and give those canned demos that they give to everyone else, the same demos that they're demoing in the booths over there, the same demos that they're demoing in sessions like this week. Make them demonstrate your unique scenarios. Now, it's a little bit of work on their part. We're asking them to jump through a little bit of hoops to do this, to prepare a little bit to meet your needs. However, you know what else you learn in that process? How willing are they to actually work with you? And you learn a lot about that, how willing they are to understand what you're truly trying to do. And it's really a much more valuable process. You also want to structure these demo weeks in a way that you're able to compare apples to apples and apples. So you actually have the vendors come in and say, all right, we're going to spend 15 minutes doing introductions, and then the next 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, you're going to demo scenarios 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, in that order. Because if you're having 3 to 4 vendors come in, you're really able to see how does vendor A match up with vendor B, match up with vendor C, and an apples to apples to apples way. It's a much more beneficial way to do this. And then you have your teams, I don't like numeric scoring, but at least have your teams rate their confidence as to how well did each vendor execute on each scenario. It's really much more beneficial use of time of all the people involved. Because the other thing that people don't really think about until after this week is, think about how much those vendor demo weeks cost your organization. Some of you will hire a consultant like me. We're not cheap. So all of you sitting in all-day meetings for 4 or 5 days, that's not cheap. Those costs add up. So you want to maximize that time as much as possible. And again, make them as real as possible. And finally, the last step is something that we call the bake-off, or it's sometimes known as the competitive proof of concept. And here, I would encourage you to actually bring in your finalists, or ideally your 2 finalists, and make it truly competitive, and actually have them mimic a real project as much as possible. So at this stage, you actually say to your 2 finalists, all right, take me through a project, lead us through a project just as you would if we were doing a real implementation. But we're not asking you to do a full build out. Just build out this subset of scenarios. And usually we're going to hone in on 2 to 3 different scenarios and say, guide us through this. So not only do you learn a lot about what it's like to work with the vendor, but this is the opportunity for your team to actually get their hands on the technology, actually run through it, try it out in your environments, and you just learn so much about the technology and the people. And the question that people always say here is, well, that's really expensive. That's going to take a lot of my people's time to go through this with multiple vendors doing it in parallel. And I agree, it is expensive. It can be expensive, it can be time consuming, but I can honestly say the most successful software implementation projects that we've ever seen are the ones that spent the most time in the bake-off phase. Because you're learning about multiple vendors, you take those lessons back with the winner, you're learning about communication styles, you're learning about the software, and you're learning a lot about yourself and your team's readiness and capacity to be successful here. So you're going through a lot of trials that often happen or usually happen after a contract has been signed and you're already off and running in an implementation. So to learn those lessons earlier is invaluable in my experience. So if you can see here, what I'm recommending is a process that is based in testing. So I want you to write those scenarios. I want you to get the right shortlist. I want you to test those vendors, make them jump through some hoops, test them at the RFP stage, test them at the demo phase, and test them at the proof of concept phase. And as you're going through this, you're winnowing down your choices, you're becoming more and more confident with the future partner that you're going to sign on the dotted line with, and by the time you get to the end here, what we found is you know a lot about them, but they know a lot about you, and that can be beneficial as well, because throughout this process you should be negotiating. Oftentimes when software vendors put a proposal across the table to you, they're guessing, right? They have this document that you sent over, but ultimately they're guessing. Are we a good fit for this, and what should the cost be associated with our services here? If you go through a process like this, they learn about your needs. They're less scared that they're going to be surprised after signing a contract, so they're more willing to say, okay, we're going to refine our pricing based on what we've learned. You might give some, they might give some, and ultimately you're coming to a negotiated contract that you're all comfortable with. So as you can imagine, scenario fit, like I talked about today, is essential. You want to make sure that you find something that is fundamentally built for your use case scenarios. But I don't mean to discount the technology fit. You want to make sure it fits within your organization. And you never want to discount the partner fit, the people side of this. It needs to be, people, when we go through this, people always say, well, they're not answering my calls. Whenever I have a call during the POC phase, we had some questions. They're not answering my calls. Should I read into anything there? And I'm like, yes, that's huge, because if they're not answering your calls during the POC phase, this is probably going to be indicative of what it's going to be like after you sign the contract. And in fact, it might be worse. And then finally, don't discount the value fit. And I mentioned that a bit here, that you never want to wait to the end of a process like this to negotiate and talk money, because vendor salespeople are very savvy. They know that you've invested a lot of time and effort doing your due diligence, going through all these processes. Do not wait till the end, because they'll know that they got you over the barrel and they can play hardball. What I want you to do is, as you're getting to know each other, I want you to start refining that cost quote at every step of the way, so that by the end, it's an easy transition into a contract. So what I tried to show here is a departure from a traditional method. So the traditional method, like we talked about, is typically you do a ton of requirements work up front. You try to document every single requirement. Then you go to the RFP, proposal, demo phase. Then you jump over the wall and start your implementation and do a big bang implementation. What I'm proposing is make it more iterative and more test-based. Spend a little bit less time on the requirements up front. Instead of trying to document every requirement, hone in on what I like to call the differentiating requirements. What makes your situation unique? What are the unique use cases that you're trying to achieve? Spend a lot of time on the RFP proposals and demo phase. That's what you do in the testing. Get into the bake-off, much more intense testing. And then that time is not wasted, because you can very easily transition some of that work that you put in that bake-off right into a live pilot, in many cases, that's phase one of an implementation can be really easily got to out of that bake-off phase, and then work into a true phased launch and implementation and launch schedule going forward. It's an approach that provides more value, more lessons, and those lessons are always delivered earlier, so you're not surprised before it's too late. I like to just repeat myself here. If you leave and remember nothing else today from this session today, is that when it comes to doing technology selection right, you have to test at every phase. Do not take the vendor's word for it. Do not take your friend's word for it. Do not take your boss's word for it. Do not take your colleague's word for it. You've got to test at every phase of the game. Even a successful implementation that your own organization did with a particular vendor can go horribly wrong in a different situation, because there's different use cases, different people on the project, very different situation that can cause very different variables that can cause a very different result. So test, but do so in an environment that makes it as real as possible. Any questions? No questions. It's easy, self-explanatory. Yes, sir.
So how big is your list of vendors?
Yeah, so we cover about 150 different technologies from a little over 100 different vendors, because some of these vendors are players in multiple cases. But I'm gonna just expand on that a little bit for this audience, because when we developed this methodology, we've actually been approached by a number of firms to apply our methodology to areas that are outside of our research area. And we've applied this to a whole slew of different technologies that we don't cover. I don't consider myself the expert on certain technologies, but this methodology works. This methodology of testing at every step of the way, making a scenario-based approach absolutely works. In fact, within the last year or so, we've actually applied this methodology to not even technology. We applied it to selecting an internal agency for one of the largest children's hospitals in the country. They came to us and said, "We like the way you helped us pick technology. We need to pick an agency of record. Can you help us do that? But we want you to apply this methodology, this real testable methodology." And we were like, "I think so." And we did it, and it was the most amazing thing, because this was a $5 million agency of record project, massive investment for this hospital, and it's been a rousing success. That they had no at the end of the day, there was no question among any of the stakeholder team who was the right fit, and it's been a huge success going forward. So we cover about 150 different vendors, but this process works for any technology. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm wondering, as a vendor who does not yet have much name recognition in the market, how do I get my name out there so that it's on that initial list so people find me and determine whether what I have is the best fit?
Yeah, so you're going to ask me how you should do your marketing? I don't know. But no, the short answer here is you need to demonstrate your suitability for different use cases, okay? I think, and we as a firm don't give advice to vendors, but in this case, I'm going to make an exception. Don't go out and say you're good at everything, because you're not, right? I know that if with enough time, money, ibuprofen, you can get any software to do anything, right? It's the SharePoint thing. Anyone have SharePoint? You can get it to do anything. It doesn't mean you should. But I think the vendors, if you can clearly showcase where your strengths are, where your product is fundamentally built to solve the problem your software is fundamentally built to solve, that goes a long way, because then you don't need people like me to sift it out for you. If you can make that as clear as day, so that someone who's going out there and doing their research, doing their homework, I think that's the first step to getting on the right shortlist. So However you can do that in your marketing to get that out there, that's what I would suggest. But I would say, as a vendor, I mean, have you ever encountered an approach like this that was very scenario-based that you had to respond to in an RFP like this?
Not this structure. We certainly have had some folks take us through some of those steps, but it
Yep.
felt a little bit more ad hoc as opposed to a very formal process that.
Yep.
And I didn't always have the impression that all vendors were being treated the same.
Right, and that's in fairness across the board is something that we preach entirely. Like I will never, our clients are advised by us. You'll get questions from vendors. Do not answer them one-on-one. We got to give everyone the same answers and same communication across the board. But I will say that vendors have come to us and said, we like this approach actually, because when they get RFPs that are laundry lists of requirements, they're all sitting there saying, we might be a good fit. We do this, requirements 53 to 63. We do that, I mean, so we'll submit a response, and it's hard to figure out. But if you have this scenario-based approach, you're able to say, yeah, we are a good fit here, and here's why. And then it's on you to say, here's how my solution meets that need and solves that problem. It's a big thing. Yes, sir.
And to tack on to that, as somebody implementing a technology project, I want to be able to find it. And if you could go back to developing the right shortlist a little bit, I think that would be a big help. If you said don't through Google, the technology implementation vendor you're working with might only know a couple different solutions. So
let me clarify that. That's a great point. I don't mean you can't go to Google. Go to Google. I just don't want you to stop at Google. I don't want it to begin and end at Google. I want you to go in some marketplaces. In marketplaces that we cover, come to Real Story Group. That's a no-brainer. But in those other marketplaces, start at Google. Definitely do your research and see who's out there. But don't stop there, right? And don't just take the stuff that appears on the first page and put those on your short list. I want you to then dig. Go find what these guys are good at. Go find their core strengths. Go find their core use cases. Make sure those guys get on your short list as opposed to just who's coming up on the first page. And that's what I meant there. So thank you for that. That's definitely a good point. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, so they're going to come up, right? And so very early in the process, when you start doing your stakeholder interviews in your organization, you try to get a holistic point of view from the various departments within your organization, everyone who really has a stake in the game. You're going to hear functional requirements come up, and I don't want you to just discount them. It's actually a good time to start making a note of those and tucking those away. But I don't want you to use those as the only way that you go out and look at evaluate vendors, right? So start to gather them right away, but it's really going to be as a part of the implementation. Once you've chosen the vendor, they're going to want to do a whole slew of information gathering again. So that's where the bulk of it comes into play, is once you move into your first phases of your implementation. So that's where you want to pull out the work that you've already done, and then with your vendor partner, fill in the gaps. But it's different. It's a little bit later in the process, but that's the time when it's most valuable.